Yeah, so today we'll be talking more about the Belshaw, his paper which defends the permissibility of eating meat. Hopefully you've seen or had a chance to see the first lecture I put together on it on Tuesday. It was kind of an interesting day just because it was a Monday schedule. I figured since we're asynchronous, in the spirit of the class being asynchronous, I would just go ahead and put together a lecture. So why don't we go ahead and turn to that. Hopefully everybody's doing great. Just going. Happy Thursday to everybody. It's your Friday. Happy academic Friday to you. Okay, drop that down. So maybe we'll begin with a little bit of just brief recapping. So we left off last time, we were talking about the theory of the badness of death for the individual that dies. And we discussed Belshaw's ultimate view. And so his view is a restricted deprivation view. So I'll just go ahead and lay it out. In fact, maybe what I'll show you first is from the Belshaw reading. We'll look at some passages together this time, just because the Belshaw, I think it'd be a tough read for some. And so it'd be helpful to maybe look at some passages together in it. So he ends up claiming that this is the view of the badness of death that he's going to endorse in this indented paragraph here. So death is bad for you in the way that matters only when it cuts off a good, an unfolding life that not unreasonably you want now or wanted earlier to live. And this is to be contrasted with a more general, less restricted version of deprivation theory or deprivation view. So if you look on page 13 here, so he very briefly states a deprivation view here. So he says, in contrasting the deprivation view with what the Epicurean view is on the badness of death, he says the deprivation view, right, holds that death's badness is a function of the good life it takes from you. That's just a general view. So you can understand the deprivation view of the badness of death for the individual that dies as involving like the claim that, right, death is bad for the individual that dies if death adversely affects the goodness of your life, the goodness of the life that was being lived. I'll put another way that might be a bit more straightforward. The general deprivation view on the badness of death for the individual that dies would be that death is bad for the individual that dies if it deprives the individual that dies of the good or the good life that the individual was living prior to the death. So that's the general deprivation view. And then he thinks that there's problems with that view. And so he develops a restricted view, as I called it. So in this, after discussing the general deprivation view, he explains its problems. So by way of recap here, maybe what I'll just do is go up a little bit here. So the Epicurean view, just to recap the point here, especially if you haven't seen the video I put together on Tuesday yet, the Epicurean view is really just this claim that death is not bad for the individual that dies. And there's various arguments that the Epicurean will run for this conclusion, for this claim. So there's some modern day Epicureans, but the reason why the view is called Epicureanism is because the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus developed an argument for the claim that death is not bad for the individual that dies. And the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus was interested in getting people to stop fearing death And one of the arguments that he developed to get people to stop fearing death, at least in his effort to get people to stop fearing death, was the claim that death isn't bad for the individual that dies. And I sketched out that argument last time. And the basic idea is just that death is a permanent end of existence. So you're not there to experience death. So he ends up claiming something famously like, while you're alive, death isn't present, so it's not bad for you. But when you're dead, then you're no longer, so death can't be bad for you then either. So death just isn't bad for you. And then you shouldn't fear that which isn't bad for you is the sort of concluding point in the Epicurus. As I mentioned, there are contemporary Epicureans that don't argue for Epicureanism following Epicurus, again, the ancient Greek philosopher. If you're just interested, I'll just name drop someone here. Hirshunov, David Hirshunov. If you're interested, he's at the University of Buffalo. He defends contemporary Epicurean view without following Epicurus in how he argues for it. So he has a paper out there called A More Palatable Epicureanism, if you're interested, but David Hirshunov would be a place to look. Just do a Google search, David Hirshunov, Epicureanism, in his PDF, or his paper should pop up. I think his papers that he has on his website, they're all Word documents. Okay, so that's just to name drop a little bit in case you're interested in looking at a contemporary Epicurean view that's not using the ancient philosopher Epicurus' argument to establish the Epicureanism. So big picture, the reason why Belshaw is concerned with thinking about the badness of death for the individual that dies is he wants to know whether death is bad for the animal that dies. Because if death is bad for the animal that dies, then that may have connections with it being wrong to kill the animals for whom death is bad for, or for whom death is bad, excuse me. So that's the big picture reason why he's interested in the issue of the badness of death. It might be an intrinsically cool topic anyways to think about in an ethics class. So there's the Epicurean view. He thinks the Epicurean view fails. Interestingly, the reason he offers for the Epicurean view failing is that Epicurus' argument fails. So he doesn't really take on any contemporary Epicureans. He doesn't take on Hirshunov. Hirshunov isn't cited in the paper, isn't discussed at all. So he's real quick in just dismissing the Epicurean view. And on the Epicurean view that was developed by Epicurus, Epicurus was arguing that death is not intrinsically bad for anyone, because in order for something to be intrinsically bad, well, it's got to be painful. And of course, if death is a permanent end of existence, there's nothing, or there's no one there existing for death to be intrinsically bad for. So what Belshaw just claims is that death can be bad without being intrinsically bad for the individual. It can be extrinsically or relationally or comparatively bad for them. And I just try to capture the claim here in terms of this example. Death may be worse for X, X is just the variable for an individual, than X is being alive. So the comparative claim as opposed to the intrinsic claim could be true. So death could be comparatively bad for the individual that dies. Okay, so the big thing with Belshaw's reply to the Epicurean view is he's real quick in responding to it. Ends up really dealing with the ancient philosopher Epicurus's argument, and then moves on pretty quickly to the deprivation view. Finds it, I think he just finds it just a more compelling view, and then thinks that the traditional view, the more general view, fails. So this is the general view. Death is bad for the individual that dies if, and to the extent that, it deprives the individual who dies of the goods of life. Very general way of putting it. This is a bit of a weaker way of putting the deprivation view. There are those who say death is bad for the individual that dies if and only if, and perhaps to the extent that it deprives the individual who dies of the goods of life. Belshaw only really considers this weaker view because if his challenge to the weaker view, or his challenges, excuse me, to the weaker view hold, then they'll also hold with respect to the stronger views. I should also note that there's a way of developing the deprivation view that doesn't include this provision, and to the extent that. So there are those who develop a deprivation view and they don't include that idea. Okay, so they're fine saying that that we need to build in the idea that um, where we're sort of comparing how bad death is to someone or for someone based on how much goodness, right, or how much of a good life individuals deprived of by death. But that's just a way of arguing or way of developing the geological space. That's worth just maybe highlighting. But this is a fairly standard version of the deprivation view, right? So then if you're thinking about the very general view that then if let's take an example, cows as the relevant animals, the relevant kind of animal in question, then death is bad for a cow, right? If and to the extent that it deprives the cow who dies of the goods of life, the good that it would have had, the goods that it would have had in its life. But now you're going to need an account of like the goods, right? You need an account of those things that contribute to a life going well for the cows. Okay, so in a fully worked out deprivation view, um, one may need to specify the correct theory of well-being, or at least have some sketch of an account of well-being worked out, so that way we know um, um, what kinds of things contribute to a life going well for the individual in question, that we're considering whether or not it's bad for that individual to have died. Okay, so Belshaw, he's a deprivation theorist, but he just thinks that the traditional view fails. We talked last time about his reasons for claiming that the more general view failed, the general deprivation view failed. Bad implications follow from it. So since death is worse for someone at 20 than at 80, then death is worse for someone at 2 than at 20. And this is really in part because we're taking very seriously the to the extent that clause in the deprivation view. So there's just more goodness that the 20-year-old is deprived of than the 80-year-old. So then there's more goodness that the 2-year-old is deprived of than the 20-year-old, or the 2-week-old compared to the 20-year-old, or the 2-day-old compared to the 20-year-old. And Belshaw claims that that even though this is all things considered going to be true, this is false. It's false that death is worse for a 2-year-old than a 20-year-old. And if that's not something that is intuitively true for you when you think about it, then just consider the 2-day-old or the 2-week-old individual. Okay. There may be an intuition clash where you just might say, yeah, it is worse for a 2-day-old to die than a 20-year-old, because on the especially if you're a deprivation theorist, you just might be willing to maintain that, at least the way the deprivation theory was fleshed out just a moment ago, the general view anyways. So Belshaw, he just takes this implication to be intuitively bad for a theory of the badness of death. But another bad implication that was cited was this. So if an individual is given a choice of 6 months of good life and then death, and then on the one hand, and then on the other hand, 6 years of good life, so not 6 months but 6 years of good life, and then death, but after a serious mind altering operation occurred, right? According to the deprivation view, the general one discussed, or under discussion currently, we should choose to have the serious mind altering operation, and then after that have 6 good years, and then meet our end, meet our death. And what Belshaw claims is that this is the wrong result. He thinks that if given a choice between these options here, we should choose the first one and not the second one. But the deprivation view, the general view under discussion, doesn't allow for that, at least in terms of its formulation. So, what's ultimately problematic with choosing the second option? I mean, you get 6 good years after all. Well, according to Belshaw, he thinks it's pretty intuitive that if you have a serious mind altering operation that radically alters your beliefs, your desires, and your values, that you come out on the other end of that operation a very much different person than you went into it. And so given that there's very, very weak psychological connections holding between the pre and the post surgery, post operation individuals, we should choose 6 months where there isn't going to be any break, or there isn't going to be a significant break in the psychological connections over time. So in the background here, this is a little tricky. In the background here for Belshaw, he does think that like psychological connectedness over time is very significant and may be really what matters to us, in terms of like our continued existence. It's what's significant to our continued existence, what's significant to our, sometimes as we put it in philosophy, our persisting through time, despite the fact that we're going to change through time. Significant is our remaining robustly psychologically connected. And once we start losing robust psychological connections over time, we start caring less, and reasonably so, stop caring less about the future selves that we become. So that's kind of in the background here for Belshaw. What's important to us and what reasonably important to us is, in thinking about decisions like here in 2, would be how psychologically connected are we to ourselves over time and through change. And he just kind of assumes that in the paper. So if you didn't know that, then you might have struggled with understanding like why the second option, according to Belshaw, is worse than the first. Okay. And then the third bad implication cited is that the badness of death for the individual that dies is independent of their desires for or interest in further life. I think this one's pretty easy to see, just because we go back to it. All the deprivation view claims is that death is bad for the individual that dies if and to the extent that it deprives the individual who dies of the goods of life, regardless of whether or not the individual in question has any interest in continued living. So that's something that Belshaw takes to be counterintuitive. Surely the badness of death should have something to do with the degree to, or should have something to do with whether the individual who dies had some kind of interest in continued existence, and perhaps the extent to which the individual in question had interest in continued existence. At least that's what Belshaw thinks. He has his detractors, as you can imagine. So these might not be bad implications for those who hold the general deprivation view, and there just may end up being a clash of intuitions between um, um, those theorists and Belshaw. So hopefully that like recap and or maybe you're hearing it for the first time discussion helped with understanding Belshaw's view of the badness of death for the individual that dies. So you see what he does here is he considers when he specifies his theory of the badness of death for the individual that dies, he considers the individual being deprived of a good unfolding life. That's certainly relevant. That's what makes him like at the core of his view a deprivation theorist. So it makes him or commits him to the deprivation view. And then it's this qualification here that makes his view restricted. So this bit about that is desired by the individual now or sometime earlier. So we have individuals who are living good lives, and they, at some point or other in that life, have desired the continued existence. They have desired to continue living that good life. And then you consider and you imagine death occurring. Well, death is bad for that individual, right? This bit about desiring continued good life or desiring the continued good life, like that condition's been satisfied. And then I just imagine that if death hadn't occurred to that individual, then that individual would have had a life, would have had a good life, would have continued living a good life. So thinking about it like the badness of death in that way might be helpful. Like, so, were the individual who died not to have died, like we ask, would that individual have lived a good life? Would that individual have continued to live a good life? And that's gonna, if we say yes to that question, the deprivation theorist generally is going to say, okay, we're on track to say that that death was bad for that individual. And then Belshaw comes in here and he builds in a further question that we could ask. Did the individual who died desire continued existence at the time of death or at some point earlier? Right. And if the answer is yes, then now the two important conditions have been satisfied and death is bad for the individual that dies. Okay. So note here he's necessary conditions for death being bad for the individual that dies. Okay. So the idea here is we may need to build in further conditions, but at the very least, these two conditions are necessary. Okay. All right, so Belshaw, he recognizes that his view of the badness of death for the individual that dies has some unwelcome implications. So he lays out his view, and as I just captured here on page 13, he said this is offered only as a necessary condition of death's badness. So there are other conditions that could be specified. And then he goes on to say on page 14, all those first full paragraph, although this amendment to the deprivation view aligns it more closely with several of our intuitions. Right? The intuitions he thinks holds when we think about the three implications of the general deprivation view. Controversially, I claim that it is not bad in the way that matters for babies to die, even when predictably their future will be good. And again, predictably, they will at some time want very much to continue with it. This life isn't something in which they have any interest now. So that's a pretty heavy duty claim. So death is never bad for babies. It's not bad for them in any way that matters. It might be bad for them in the sense that they won't be able to flourish, they won't be able to continue growing, they won't be able to enjoy, the pleasures that come with being a baby and loved and all the rest. So pretty straightforward claim here. I claim it's not bad in a way that matters for babies to die. It can be bad for the loved ones of babies that the babies die, but not for the babies themselves. Okay. Okay. Now there are some philosophers when they think about the related idea of the wrongness of killing. So there's the badness of death, and then there's a wrongness of killing. They're distinct views, but there's some connection between them, typically mentioned in the literature, at least in some important papers on these topics. Who would claim that it's not wrong, or who would claim that it's wrong to kill an individual right, only if the individual who's killed is deprived of the goods that they would have had were they not to have been killed. And then some of them will build in some interest or desire for continued existence condition. And those theorists will then end up biting the bullet and saying it's not wrong to kill a baby in a way that matters. It's not wrong to kill a baby in the sense that the baby is the moral victim. It's the parents who'd be the victims, or some other loved one who would be the moral victims. And some people find that very counterintuitive. They say, no, the baby is the moral victim. So such theorists sometimes will claim that it is wrong generally to kill babies, but it's wrong because the parents were wronged. So they kind of shift who the victim is, or who the primary victim is anyways. Okay. So that seems to be a pretty untoward, unwelcome implication, right? It's not bad in a way that matters for babies to die. So that's an implication of Belshaw's view. And the second implication, it's not bad for most non-human animals to die. So in the next paragraph, right, also claim that's not bad in a way that matters for most non-human animals to die. Is this simply because even if they can live good lives, they have no future directed desires? And he says, perhaps this is true, but the argument needs only the weaker, surer condition that they don't have desires for more life, or desires for that which gives them reason to want more life. Squirrels, for example, don't want now to go on living so that they can eat the nuts they have stored away in the winter months. Hens don't want to survive in order to meet up soon with the farm's new cockerel. And am I making this claim for all animals? No, higher mammals have more complex psychology, and perhaps some of these can have future concerns relevantly similar to ours. Okay. But then he goes on to say, top of page 15, but certainly it is true for most animals, and certainly most of those that we eat. Okay, so we're talking about the ethics of meat eating here. These animals, I claim, are best thought of as having psychologies comprising more or less discrete series of episodes, which, even if they resemble one another, are not perceived as such from the inside, and is not a matter of regret, I contend, if this series should at any time come to an abrupt end. So animals are painted as having these pretty shallow psychologies. It's just one experience followed by another experience followed by another experience. Episodic experiences where there's minimal to no reflection on those experiences. Very little, if any, thinking forward into the future. and certainly not thinking about the desire or interest to continue living into the future. And so then, right, according to Belshaw's view, which has that condition, a necessary condition for death to be bad for the individual that dies, it's not going to be satisfied. The condition that maintains that death is bad for the individual that dies only if the individual that dies has some interest in continuing living the good life that he, she, or it is living. Okay. So hopefully, yeah, go ahead, Alicia.
I'm curious if there's anything about, like, a squirrel is still scared to die, like they're not trying to die. So that's like survival instinct. Is that anything, does that have anything to do with, like, does he consider that?
I mean, it could, but I mean, this is his discussion here. Like, where it stops, and then he moves on and starts with another topic. So we don't really get too much more. There's a bit more here in the footnotes, but no, I mean, for like the squirrel might be trying to survive. The squirrel may experience fear. But that's an episodic thing. Now, some out there in the literature would claim that the fact that squirrels will run away from danger provides evidence, empirical evidence, that there's some desire for continued existence. Or that if a cow is in line to be slaughtered and tries to, run away, hopping fences to get away, that suggests that they look ahead and see, oh, I'm going to die if I keep going, right? It may not be as sophisticated as that, sort of thought that I just, uttered, right? But there's something there that's sophisticated enough to get them, or that there's something in there that's sophisticated enough that shows or provides some evidence that there's some future thinking going on. So if I'm right, he says this, is this simply because even if they can live good lives, they have no future directed desires? I take his response here to be that maybe they do have something that's future directed, but it isn't significant enough ultimately. So yeah, of course we wish he said more here, but he doesn't. If you are interested in some of the empirical work, someone who would disagree with Belshaw, who Belshaw discusses, or he mentions in a footnote in the paper, is Peter Singer. So on page, if you have the PDF, if you just wanted to note it, on page 22 of the Belshaw, he references Peter Singer. He references Peter Singer is 1993. So there, Singer, he has a chapter in his book called Practical Ethics. It's called, the title of the chapter is Killing Animals. And the first part of the chapter is Singer laying out some empirical evidence that the vast majority of animals that we would eat, or the vast majority of animals that we think about when we think about animals, anyways, have robust enough psychologies to suggest that they do have future directed desires and desires for continued living. And even though Belshaw references the 1993 version or edition of Practical Ethics, there have been subsequent updated versions. I think the most recent was maybe 2010 or thereabouts. So there's been some updating done on that front. So yeah, it could be that Belshaw just is underestimating animal psychology here. Certainly, I think Singer would claim that he is. Yeah, that's a great question, and one that would require, I think, delving pretty deep into animal psychology. But there is that chapter. If you're interested, let me know. I have a PDF of the chapter I could send you. Okay. So according to Belshaw, the deprivation theory, the deprivation view generally, as ordinarily stated, is too general, has bad implications. So he qualifies the theory, but then his qualifications might be too much for one to stomach. So, but I'll leave that to the leave that to you guys to determine, to think about more carefully, so we can move forward here a little bit. So then the next topic is the goodness of death. So there might be connections between death being good for the individual that dies and the permissibility of killing those individuals. And I say might because we're going to see what Belshaw has to say about that in a moment. So Belshaw claims that death can sometimes be good for the individual that dies. At the very least, it can be better for an individual to die than to go on continue living. And so he ends up giving us an account of, he takes it to be quite intuitive that this is so. So he ends up giving us his view pretty quickly. So let's look at his view. So it's on page 15. Death is good for you in the way that matters, when, but not only when. So I understand that this when as an if, but not only if. It cuts off a life that is worse than nothing. You don't want to live this life, and you don't want to live this life, excuse me. So this is, bouncing off of the deprivation account, the badness of death, to talk about the goodness of death. So death is good for you in the way that matters, when or if it cuts off a life that is worth nothing, and you don't want to live this life. Here's how I interpret that. Death is good for the individual that dies if death ends a life that is worse than death, right? It ends a life that, in a sense, isn't worth living anymore, right? When we compare, like, the life with, the life ending, death. And then here's the relevant qualification, and the individual that dies doesn't want to continue living. So these are sufficient conditions. When we take these together, they're sufficient conditions for death being good for the individual that ends a life. So it's important, this sufficient condition point, because there could be other things that contribute to death being good for the individual that dies. It's just that when you take these two conditions here, we've got sufficient or sufficiency holding, and death being good for the individual that dies. So if it was only if, then these conditions would have to be satisfied for death to be good for the individual that dies. But just providing at least one set of conditions that are sufficient for death being good for the individual that dies. Okay, so if just the idea of a sufficient condition is tricky, or even a necessary condition, is the contrast concept here is tricky, maybe a helpful example would serve. So you might think, just think about a sufficient condition. You might think, trying to specify sufficient condition or set of sufficient conditions for a cookie, right? Let's say a cooked cookie, to simplify things a little bit here, a baked cookie. Well, you're going to need some ingredients, some kind of ingredients, perhaps flour of some kind. Doesn't have to be wheat, of course, but some kind of flour, and then other ingredients. You need some kind of heat source. For it to be sufficient, you need, or for sufficient condition for something counting as a cookie. Let's see if I can put this a little bit more clearly. You could say wheat flour, sugar, eggs, chocolate, peanut butter. So some, then some heat source. And so those are sufficient conditions for something being a cookie, but there are other sufficient conditions as well, right? Conditions that don't involve wheat flour or eggs. Suppose we're making vegan cookies, or suppose we're making raw cookies, or cookies that don't have any flour at all, but they still count as cookies. So there are different sets of sufficient conditions um, that are available for something counting as a cookie. Um, then you might ask, well, what's necessary for something being a cookie? And that might be a little trickier. But now, what's necessary for something being a baked cookie is that there's some heat source, right? And there's some ingredients. Those are required to have a baked cookie. So the requirement tells us we got sufficient conditions in place. And then sufficient conditions tell us that we've got enough of something for something to be satisfied or to be brought about. Hopefully the cookie example helps. If it doesn't, let me know. I can think of other examples off the top of my head if necessary. Good. So the goodness of death, thinking about animals. Well, when's death good for animals? Well, cases of endless agony. So imagine an animal that's just in severe pain. Seems like when the future promise is nothing but agony, killing or the death of the animal is good. Cases where the agony ends and a good future is predictable, but the animal is in a state of agony. Seems like it's good for animals to die then as well. And then cases of cases generally of future agony. So with the current and continuing good life. So the first case is easy. The second case might be a little tricky. So just imagine some animal being in agony currently. But we know that it's predictable that the agony is going to end in a little while, or a week, a month, whatever. And then from there on out, a good future is predictable, maybe because the animal is rescued and brought to a place where it will be given a good life thereafter. Belshaw wants to claim that when the animal is going through the agony, even though good future is predictable, it could be good for the animal to die. And then imagine a case where we have an animal in front of us that's living a good life, and that good life is going to continue, but then we're able to predict that in 1 year, 2 years, whatever, there's going to be quite a bit of agony. Well, then Belshaw argues that it'd be good for those animals to die as well. So what Belshaw wants to claim, it's not just when we think about these cases, these aren't cases of just simply weighing costs and benefits against each other, thinking, well, the agony, when it outweighs the good futures, when the agony outweighs the good life or the good lives, then death is good. So he tells us on bottom of page 16 here. So I just kind of take his examples and I just generalize from them. So the appeal here, he claims, isn't to some straightforward cost-benefit analysis, whereby death is better for an animal if its future will be bad on balance. So the death might be understood as good in the sense of being better for it than continued existence. So Belshaw discusses the goodness of death in both ways as just goodness, full stop, or better than goodness. Goodness is better than continued existence or continued life. So again, the appeal here isn't to some straightforward cost-benefit analysis, whereby death is better for an animal if its future life will be bad on balance. Even if there are many years of good life ahead, still it's not worth an animal suffering a day's agony, he claims, in order for it to live that life. And this is true whether the day's agony comes at the beginning or at the end of those good years, even if the pleasures ultimately outweigh the pains, you see. So that would tell us right straight away that we're not talking about just a straightforward cost-benefit analysis. It's the mere fact that an animal could be experiencing agony be enough to make it better for that animal to stop living, to die. So again, even if the pleasures outweigh the pains, they can't properly compensate the animal for undergoing them. And then he goes and says, or so I claim. Do I claim that all animals can be benefited by death? That death can be better for them than continued living? He says no, as it's hard to see how death can be good for a plant, so too for animals, if there are any, that don't feel pain. Perhaps death cannot be good for insects, worms, mollusks, etc., but can be, and very often will be, good for the animals that we most often eat. Because many of them are going to experience quite a bit of badness, quite a bit of pain and suffering, agony at some point or other. So, what does the footnote say here? Yeah. Most often, the meat eating readers of this book are likely to consume chicken, pork, or beef. Even so, in terms of individual animals, they perhaps eat more shrimp, mussels, clams. In several parts of the world, insects, grubs, and snails also need to be factored in. And this is certainly true if we're thinking about, which I think is in the background here for Belshaw, if we're thinking about the animals that we put in factory farms, which is the most commonly consumed meat, industrial produced meat on these large farms that put animals in these, you know, factory-like settings where they're crammed in and living in tight quarters with large number of other animals. Yep, go ahead, Alicia.
So this is the justification for factory farming, but what about the extinction of animals because of human like activity destroying habitats? Is that still, it's almost like he's saying that we don't need to be concerned with that because the animals are better off if they die because we are disrupting their habitat.
Well, I'm not sure. So maybe let's see if I can understand what you're saying a little bit better. So he's actually, and I'm not sure I heard you correctly, but he's actually opposed to factory farming. So he wasn't trying to justify factory farming. He's just saying that, animals that we factory farm, they are better off dying, better off, dead than living in the factory farms. So there's a couple ways you can go with that, but one way you could go with that is to say then we shouldn't factory farm, right? Because we're not giving them the quality of lives that they should have. So their death is in some sense good for them, better for them than continue living in factory farms.
So if we ended factory farming and they were living in like wonderful conditions, then death isn't good for them because they're not in agony.
Not quite. So that might be true in some cases, but he's going to end up making a qualification later that he thinks is an important one to make.
Okay.
So hang tight on that. Your question's a great one, but he deals with that issue really later. So good. Ultimately, he's gonna claim that even if we give animals good lives, or the lives that we would commonly give them on traditional farms as opposed to industrial farms, that still it could be better for them not to live, better for them to die. Okay, but that's not the full story either. Okay, so now after dealing with the issues of the badness of death, the goodness of death for the individual that dies, and thinking about those issues in relation to animals, he moves on to killing. Because in many cases, think about eating meat, we raise animals, and then we kill them to consume them. So he begins page 17, very top page 17. He says, if it isn't bad for animals to die, does it follow that we are permitted to kill them? And if death is good or better for animals and continue living further, are we further required to kill them? And these are, very natural questions that drop out of thinking about the badness of death and the goodness of death. We relate them to animals. But what Belshaw ends up claiming is I make no such sweeping claims. So even if there is a connection, there isn't a tight necessary connection between them. So just because death is bad, death isn't bad for the animal that dies, it doesn't mean that we can straight away infer from that it's okay to kill them. And then likewise, we can't straight away infer from death being good for animals that we're required to kill them. And he goes on to say that details are going to matter. So there are very often reasons not to kill an animal. It is someone's pet, or it belongs to a rare breed, or other animals depend on it. So think about the classic case would be the animal in question may have young, or the animal in question may be important for other animals surviving. Think about just the food chain, the natural food chain that exists in the natural world. So the details will matter here. So I have on this slide here just those passages quasi-summarized. So I just read from 17, the killing section. The claim that death isn't bad for most animals doesn't, all by itself anyways, imply that killing them is morally permissible. The claim that death is good for an animal doesn't, all by itself, imply that killing the animal is morally required. So I think I take then these claims about there not being a tight implication relation holding is captured by the I make no sweeping claims here, right? Because the details will matter. Okay. And then he goes on to deal with the issue of animals feeling pain, animals, he was talking before about animals feeling agony. The claim that animals feel pain when killed does not by itself imply that it's morally wrong to kill them. So some might cite the fact that killing an animal involves inflicting pain on the animal, and that's what accounts for the wrongness of killing animals. And what Belshaw claims is that that implication doesn't hold. And in order to establish that that implication doesn't hold, he gives us some examples. The case of veterinary euthanasia. So where someone takes an animal to the pound or to the vet, and the vet recommends that the animal be put under or the animal be killed, that's going to involve some pain being inflicted on the animal, but we think that is permissible in some cases to go along with the euthanasia. He doesn't call it euthanasia in his paper. I call it veterinary euthanasia to give it a tag. What does he call it? He calls it putting an animal out of its misery and bringing it to the vet. Cases of killing a wounded animal. His example there is of a badger, I believe. Yeah, we come across a wounded badger. And he says he'd be okay in those cases to kill the badger. So we're adding to the pain that the badger's already in killing the badger and shooting the badger, even if it ends up being an unclean shot that doesn't kill the badger instantaneously, he says. And then perhaps most controversially, he says, even if we have a healthy rabbit that's not currently in pain, he thinks that we can kill a healthy rabbit. We can shoot a healthy rabbit. I think that he claims this, doesn't give us many details on this, but I think he says this, if I'm right, because he thinks that rabbits have pretty simple psychological lives, pretty inferior psychologies, just generally speaking. Okay, so it'd be nice if he said more about that, but he ends up claiming that even if you come across a healthy rabbit, it'd be okay to inflict pain on it by shooting it and killing it. So even if it's not a clean shot, he says, that's a way of saying that you can inflict pain on it, because presumably that would be if you shoot the rabbit as a clean shot, you kill the rabbit instantaneously or some such. Okay. Then he goes on to maintain that it's permissible and even required in some cases to kill animals. The clearest cases are those, again, all things considered, the details will matter, in which an animal is presently in pain. Okay, so I think about the badger example, or think about examples where animals have come down with some disease, and so it's pretty clear that they're suffering. And then from there, he asks, well, which animals do we have no reason to kill presently? And here his language, I think, is a bit difficult to follow. But he's thinking about this in terms of thinking about what's best for the animals. And his answer is those that don't feel pain, those that have desires for future life. So we're going to talk about some of the higher mammals here, and then those that don't feel pain, it can be killed later. So we don't have to kill them now, but we can postpone the killing of them because we know where they're at and all the rest. Now the animals that don't feel pain, I didn't know if Belshaw here meant something like their physiological makeup makes it impossible for them feeling pain, or if he meant those animals that don't feel pain currently. I couldn't parse what exactly he meant there exactly. So if I'm right, it's this is the last paragraph in the killing section on page 18. Thinking just of what is best for them, of which animals it is true that we have no such reasons for killing them now. First, those that don't feel pain. They don't feel pain like now, that physiologically such that they don't feel pain. I'm not sure what he means. Second, those, if any, that have desire for future life. And third, those, and there are many that feel no pain now and can be killed later. So maybe that don't feel pain, that just means that they're physiologically not feeling capable of feeling pain. And the context here fixes that because here he talks about feel no pain now, and that's the distinction. So these are not capable, these animals here aren't capable of feeling pain, and these are capable of feeling pain but just feel no pain now. So I think that maybe that rereading helps me parse a bit more clearly what he means. I'm not still totally sure, but anyways, that's just worth mentioning, because then there's going to be a whole ton of reasons, or there will be some very general reasons, more exactly, that we can invoke for killing a wide range of animals out there. Okay, so now after dealing with the killing issue, now we're dealing with the eating issue, and you can see how that could go. Well, we have reasons to kill animals. Okay. But then now, could we eat the animals that we kill? So he's kind of dealing with things sort of in a step-by-step way. He writes in a very pregnant way at times, so it'd be difficult to follow and take some very careful focus to follow him if you tried reading him so far. And he ends up claiming that other things being equal, I suggest that we are permitted to eat dead animals, but other things may not be equal. The permission is moot if other people, owners, or onlookers object, and moot too if other animals, hungry or grieving, have some competing claim. So it's moot in a different way insofar as the animals or their parts are inedible. Either there is no meat or the meat is in some way tainted. Okay. So generally speaking, it's permissible. Is it required? So generally speaking, it's permissible, but there are these qualifications that are worth noting. Who owns the animal that's been killed? Do other people have an objection? Do other animals have some claim to eating the killed animal? They might have some claim because think about the food chain and how they require eating other animals in order to survive. I think that's what he has in mind here. Would be a way of establishing a competing claim, quote unquote. But then he goes on to say that eating meat isn't required because we don't need to eat meat on health grounds, and most of us eat meat anyways just out of pleasure and convenience. Then he says that it's not among the higher pleasures. And he fleshes that out by saying, no one will say that you ought to enjoy eating meat, even if they say you ought to give it a try. Okay. Okay. No one will say that the lives of meat eaters, like the lives of opera lovers, go better than they would otherwise. Okay. The lives of meat eaters can be plenty fine without, or the lives of our lives can be plenty good for us if we didn't eat meat. Okay. Good. So I've already discussed what Belshaw wants to claim here. Excuse me. Here's the question that he wants to answer after dealing with the killing issue. It's the eating issue. Is it morally permissible to eat the animals that we are morally permitted or required to kill? Belshaw, all things being equal, yes, but we are not morally required to eat such animals for the reasons offered. And the all things being equal just tells us that there are complications, theoretical complications. We need to consider, right, the situations that we're in. Okay, who owns the animal that's killed, whether or not other animals have claims to eat that which is killed, etc. Okay, then an important wrinkle gets brought up. Since we can kill animals because their lives aren't worth living, right, in ways that matter, then we can prevent them from coming into existence instead, it seems. Right? So instead of killing them and then eating them, why don't we just prevent them from coming into existence in the first place? Many of the animals that are going to come into existence, we bring into existence so that way we can enjoy them. That way we can ultimately eat them. So we kill them and then we eat them after we bring them into existence. But why not prevent them from coming into existence in the first place? Okay, so indeed, many of the animals we eat are in the relevant category here. Okay, so perhaps it's best to stop bringing them into existence. So they're in this category of having lives that aren't worth living. Most of the animals that we eat, they're raised in industrial or factory farms. And then he'd even go on further. Belshaw would go on further to say even those who are raised on more traditional farms that aren't industrial in nature, many of those animals don't live lives that are worth living either. So he develops the animal annihilation argument, which is basically this, which I've highlighted here, not signed, but since. So this is the animal annihilation argument. So there are those out there who are in the animal liberation movement who claim that animals need to be liberated. Belshaw claims that really what they want, at least what many of them want, is just that we stop bringing animals into existence, giving them bad lives, and then killing them and eating them. So Belshaw's response involves there being three initial considerations that count against the animal annihilation argument, considerations for having animals we consume remain in existence. So these are considerations for having animals we consume remain in existence. Okay. And Belshaw says there are aesthetic reasons, environmental reasons, and animal welfare reasons. So the discussion of the animal annihilationism starts on page 19. Here are the aesthetic, environmental, and animal welfare reasons. So he claims here at the very bottom of page 19, but why might it be good to have these animals in existence as opposed to not bringing them into existence in the first place? He says, well, here's one reason, aesthetic reasons. We want animals to be in existence so we can enjoy them aesthetically, enjoy the natural world. He mentions the Scottish Highlands, which have mountains, heather, grouse, and deer. Okay, so we're thinking about how having these animals existing contributes to the aesthetics, to our aesthetic experiences, keeps them more beautiful. Okay. Environmental reasons. So here we may need to keep animals. We may keep animals coming into existence, keep bringing them into existence, allowing them to come into existence. So that way the environment can be benefited. Okay. So those are going to be the environmental reasons. And then animal welfare reasons. So do we need animals for the sake of further animals? So he gives the example of cows or cow pats, right? the elimination of cows that flies eat, which then feed swallows. Just one example here. So here you might just be thinking just very generally about the chain of animal life, the natural ecology, which um, how animals depend on each other, even their byproducts, even what they eliminate to contribute positively to other animals. Okay, so that's just to flesh out a little bit these three considerations that Belshaw considers. But then he says these considerations themselves won't defeat the animal annihilation argument. They all involve using animals for some further benefit, which won't justify keeping animals alive. And in order to support this idea of using animals for some further benefit, whether they're, again, aesthetic, environmental, or animal welfare related, compare using animals for meat production in traditional hunting and modern industrial forms. Well, farms, I think, is what I wanted. Using animals for meat production doesn't provide the animals with lives worth living. So just because we're using animals to further benefit in the various ways already mentioned, doesn't mean that we're giving animals that are lives worth living. Just like how we may use animals to benefit us for our pleasure, to consume them. Right? Doesn't mean we're giving them lives that are worth living. So why bring animals into existence in the first place? That's still sort of an issue. 2 lines of reply are on offer. Bringing animals into existence doesn't harm them in ways that matter. And bringing animals into existence bringing animals into existence provides some benefit to them. Too many benefits there. Okay. But so in response to the animal annihilation argument, we can claim by bringing animals into existence, we're not harming them in the ways that matter, and we can benefit them. We can benefit the very animals by bringing them into existence. And here we need to consider the earlier stages of animal existence. So then the idea, it's then morally permissible to bring animals into existence. Let's unpack this a little bit here. And he says here, he deals with the issue of which lives are worth living. And he says, we might, in considering this, ask also which are worth continuing, which are worth starting. Human lives are often worth continuing. It's often worth paying some price, perhaps undergoing a painful operation to sustain a life. Like, so that's the easy case, the case of bringing other human beings into life. The human lives, by and large, are worth living. And then he goes on top of page 22, first full paragraph, animal lives contrast here. These are, I've claimed, rarely worth continuing. None of those we want or have self-direct, none of those that we want, that we eat, want, or have self-directed reasons to live on, nor are these lives for their own sake worth starting. No animal wants to come into existence. Are they worth living? The lot of most of them is at best dull and nondescript. It often involves a near endless struggle for just mere survival. Even if it can be good for others, it's hard to see how it can be good for these animals, or good in itself, or good for the universe that such lives are lived. It seems it may well be best for them that they never exist. Okay, and then he gives examples of some qualifications, like how dogs, puppies and dogs tend to live good lives, but then he says, think about cats, they don't seem to, after they're mature, they don't seem to live good lives thereafter. They seem pretty bored with life, they're pretty aloof. And then ultimately what he wants to say here is he ends up wanting to say that when we consider the earlier stages of animal existence, we note that animals tend to be curious, they're exploratory, they seem to have quite a bit of pleasure, or they tend to experience a lot of pleasure. They seem interested in living while they're young, but as they age, they lose that. And so we don't harm animals by bringing them into existence for them to enjoy that first part of their lives. And moreover, we can positively benefit them because they do seem, while they're young, at least the vast majority of animals, to enjoy their lives while they're young, far more than as they age, as you would claim. So the key to an animal living a life worth living is that it be let to live in its early stages of positive enjoyment. After this period, when more pain is predicted than enjoyment, an animal can be killed and thus eaten. So that's the important qualification that I mentioned a few moments ago in response to the last question, or one of the last questions. Okay. So we have reason to bring animals into existence to allow them to continue coming into existence, but those involve thinking about the early stages of animal life. Can it also be morally required to bring animals into existence? And he says, well, in order to establish the moral requirement as opposed to the moral permissibility, he says we would need to develop an argument about how it is good for us to bring them into existence. How it's good for us, not just good for the animal, providing some positive benefit to the animal in question. And his argument ultimately is, the requirement will be here established by thinking about how we're going to get pleasures from bringing the animals into existence. We're going to enjoy our companionship with them, perhaps, and eating them, even. So in conclusion, there are good reasons for the practice of meat eating. They can help with providing benefits to animals. Okay. And these benefits to animals would not exist without the motivation to raise animals for food. We wouldn't be interested in bringing the animals into existence ultimately, by and large, if we weren't going to be able to kill them to eat them. So we can benefit animals by bringing them into existence, giving them short, good lives, killing them and eating them, and then repeat. Okay. All right. So with the end there, I'm kind of summarizing the key Belshaw endpoint. So hopefully it's clear and will help clarify reading the last several pages of the Belshaw. Any questions or comments? Okay, then we'll go ahead and stop here. And if you have any questions or comments or concerns about anything, let me know by email or office hours. And hope you have a great rest of your day and have a great weekend. If I want to hear from you over the weekend, then I'll see you all on Tuesday. All right, have a great one.
Thank you.
Thank you.